Well, the EU's ambassador to Georgia has called the government's decision to suspend accession talks sad and heartbreaking. The envoy said the move contradicted not only the policy of all previous governments, but also the wishes of the vast majority of the population. According to opinion polls, 85% of Georgians want the country to join the EU. Relations between the government and the EU have deteriorated as the Georgian Dream Party increasingly introduced draconian Russian-style legislation ahead of a widely disputed election in October. Well, for his assessment, I'm joined now on the line from London by the European Affairs analyst, Dr. Marek. Laskiewicz. Dr. Laskiewicz, as always, good to see you. So, fair to say, a brutal response from the authorities to these protests. We've seen footage of protesters being beaten up, among them journalists who were wearing very clear press jackets.
Yes, quite so. Georgia's at present ruled by not just a pro-Russian government, but one that uses Russian-style tactics, which are, of course, also adopted elsewhere in the world, outside of democracies. And therefore, I expect these to carry on, the protests for some time, and of course, the brutal oppressive tactics to quench such demonstrations.
And all this harkens back, does it not, to the recent election that the Georgia Dream Party won, but which most people do not accept. And the suspension of the EU accession talks came after the European Parliament voted to reject the results of those elections.
Quite so. As the government of Georgia sees it, this is EU meddling. And since it doesn't want to really join the EU, but wishes to remain pro-Russian, leaving us out now the talks to join EU is actually everything it wants. So therefore, it's acting precisely as its critics state, choosing the path for Georgia irrespective of what the majority of people want.
So, I mean, how much do these protests threaten the government in Tbilisi?
In my opinion, not so much. The central problem is not that the protests aren't well organized, that they're not supported. The central problem is geopolitical. Georgia lies right at the foot of Russia, and there's no way anyone can do anything much to help. Ukraine, for example, had a similar moment in the Orange Revolution. And the problem there for Russia was much weaker, and also Ukraine bordered Europe. Now Russia is stronger, and Georgia does not border Europe. So I anticipate these protests, whilst they'll continue for some time, will not be able to overthrow the government. To this day, Putin mentions that his pro-Russian candidate, who at one point won the elections in the presidency, should have stayed as president. So I honestly doubt he will let Georgia slip away, as in effect he did Ukraine back in 2004.
Well, I mean, for those of us who are far away from Georgia, I mean, the fault lines seem so clear and stark, tending either towards the EU or towards Russia. I mean, why does this matter so much to Georgians?
Well, the Georgians basically, like the Moldovans before, like many other people, see a quite clear, as it were, divergence. The EU offers essentially a much more prosperous future, and one which young people in particular could look forward to getting jobs and securing an ever higher standard of living. This is not the case with going with Russia, and although many older residents prefer it, because Russia does confer some sort of stability, and incidentally, of course, is its biggest neighbor, literally just on its doorstep. And so, unlike Moldova and Ukraine, I do stress it can't be helped in any way by the EU easily. It's not even if it joined the EU, that will be very easy to carry on trading with Georgia in the same way that Moldova and Ukraine are open to such trade. So it will follow logically that although the people want the prosperous EU future, it is unlikely to be granted in the near future.
Indeed, because these accession talks take a very long time, and the government in Tbilisi said they were putting it off for 4 years. But I mean, that's not what most people believe. They believe that essentially they're bringing those talks to an end. I mean, does the government seem, in your assessment, set and determined in its perceived objective to bring Georgia into the orbit of Russia?
Yes, that is quite unquestionably its goal. As you rightly say, it's not simply stopping the accession talks for some time. If it can, it will call them off forever, and so stay within Russia's orbit forever. And that this is, of course, the clear problem now. Therefore, what will happen is, at least for the next few years, it will stay in the Russian orbit until either Russia loses the Ukrainian war or the subsequent elections prove impossible to manipulate. And so a pro-EU government will finally take power simply by the sheer number of people supporting such a government.
So would it be fair to say that this is an unprecedented time in Georgia's history?
Oh, yes. Georgia historically has not had that much ties with Europe. I mean, it calls itself a European country now, but to be quite honest, for centuries on end, it had very little to do with Europe. It's true that Georgian traders, for example, turn up in Poland because Poland at one point was bigger. And so certainly it had some contact with Europe, but it's only now it's thinking of becoming a European country, wants to do so. So in that sense, yes, it would be very much a new Georgia if it were to join Europe. It would be one with its traditions, of course, but even so, it would be a huge turning point in its history were this to occur, which is by no means obvious as we sit here now.
Thanks ever, Dr. Laskiewicz. Dr. Marek Laskiewicz is the European Affairs Analyst. He was talking to me on the line there from London.